Welcome to Oh the Humanities, a podcast produced by the University of New England Center for Global Humanities. Our conversations are devoted to shining a light on the important work being done in the humanities at UNE and other colleges across the U.S. and around the world. My name is Josh Pahigian, and I'm your host. I'm delighted today to welcome our very first guest to the show, my longtime colleague and friend, Beth DeWolfe. Beth is joining us today remotely. Beth is a history professor at the University of New England. She's a prolific writer, a scholar. She's beloved by her students. I've heard her describe the focus of her scholarship as unveiling the stories of ordinary women's extraordinary lives. She's written countless articles on this topic, and her books include such titles as The Murder of Mary Bean and Other Stories, Shaking the Faith, Women, Family, and Mary Marshall Dyer's Anti-Shaker Campaign, and Such News of the Land, American Women Nature Writers. This past spring, Beth submitted her latest book to the University Press of Kentucky. It will be published in the summer of 2025. We'll discuss it a little later in our talk, but first, let me welcome Beth to Oh the Humanities. Beth, you're the very first guest on the very first episode of this podcast, so congratulations. How are you doing?
I am doing well, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this new podcast. I'm very excited. There's nothing I like more than talking about the humanities.
And same with me. And whenever I see you on campus through the years, we've known each other for a long time, I've always found that our conversations are very interesting. I'm always glad I bumped into you. So I'm glad we can chisel out some time now to have a little bit more formal conversation. So thanks so much. I thought we'd start by discussing the totality of your life's work as a historian, and then we can work our way around to your more recent work. I was wondering, why did you choose ordinary women as your focus? And when was that a conscious decision you made? When did you find that as sort of your niche within your field? And I ask as someone, myself, I studied literary fiction in grad school and thought I was going to be a fiction writer. And then like a door opened and I walked through it just sort of serendipitously. And I became a baseball travel expert and a baseball pop culture expert. And I wasn't really planning to go there. And I was wondering for you if your journey was one that was maybe a little more intentional than mine was, or if you how did you find that area of expertise, and just tell us how you made that work.
I think we have to go all the way back to high school, and I will admit to all the listeners who are engaged by the humanities that I was bored silly in U.S. history. Mm-hmm. I did great in my history classes. I could memorize facts and dates, but in my 14, 15-year-old mind, I was thinking, didn't people like me ever do anything in history? Now, granted, I was in high school in the 70s, very traditional, great men, big history, top down. So I headed off to college as a science student. I was majoring in geology. I wanted to be an astronaut. Okay, I was way too short for the space program, but I was very engaged by the space sciences. And then I had to take a core curriculum class in anthropology, and I fought it tooth and nail. And I can't even remember the name of the class I took, but it blew my mind that people did things differently than Americans did them, that cultures had long, long histories of both continuity and change. And I suddenly learned and saw that it was a big, wide world out there. So I went from geology to anthropology and went to graduate school in anthropology, where I was really first introduced to women's history. And I was in the right place at the right time, because the 1980s we could really point to as the start of women's history as an academic discipline. And so bump forward a few years, and I go back to school for my doctorate. And it was there that at Boston University in the American Studies program, that it fed both my interdisciplinary background, as I had degrees in anthropology, art history, and a lot of study in astronomy, and combining that with my work experience in art history, as I worked at the Portland Museum of Art. all of that melded together with some very passionate faculty, and that led me to look at women. But again, that little voice from my 14-year-old brain saying, what about women like me? Women who just live ordinary lives. And that's when it came to me that just doing this podcast, teaching, going to the market, what you buy, the clothes you wear, how you interact with your partners, your children, that is history. And so it just, in my head, it just seemed like a mission to bring back the voices of women that we otherwise would never know about. And that's been my life's work.
And it's really inspiring to me to hear you talk so passionately about, you just made a really good case for the value of a liberal arts education, having exposure to multiple disciplines, drawing from different disciplines to find your specialty. That's really, I feel like so often nowadays we put this pressure on young people. You know, they're 17 years old. What college are you going to go to, and what are you going to major in, and how quickly can you get out into the world and monetize that education? And sometimes, traditionally, and sometimes still maybe, education should be viewed as a journey of discovery, a journey of exploration, and really. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And as someone who teaches our human tradition sequence, our world civilization part of the core curriculum, I see it every semester. I see students in my classroom who are all but sitting with their arms crossed saying, I have to take this class and it's going to be awful. And so my mission is I'm going to get them by the end of the semester to say, so that's why Brazilians speak Portuguese, but Mexicans speak Spanish. Oh, that's why. Or, and especially in my women focus class, I want students to ask questions. I want them to say, but honestly, I want a lot of them to be a little bit angry.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about the murder of Mary Bean, and I know I believe your first book. Is that right?
That was my second.
It was your second, but it came out. It had to be almost 2 decades ago now,
yes.
Right? I remember reading it when it first came out, and I remember you came and did a lecture back when the Center for Global Humanities was in its infancy. But I reread it in preparation for this call about a month ago when you agreed to come on the show. I remember enjoying it much the same way the first time, but I enjoyed it a little differently this time and appreciate it a little bit more. Both readings, I could appreciate the local aspect of it. I live in Saco, so hearing a story of what Saco was like 150 years ago, and some of these shady characters from the underworld, the doctor and the tavern keeper, and meeting the women who are at sort of this important time for women trying to claim agency in a world to go out into the world and work in the mills along the Saco River. Like that was interesting to me, of course, both times. But this time reading it in a post-Roe world, or I guess I should say a post-Dobbs world, where women's bodily autonomy, the landscape has changed here in the United States, and the challenges women face to have reproductive rights and be able to sort of chart their own paths that way have definitely become more limited. So for me reading it this time, there was like more immediacy to that aspect of the story. Maybe you can summarize the book or the arc of it better than I can, but it's a story of a young woman who finds herself pregnant, and we learn about what medicine is like. I believe there are some allopathic physicians at the time, but there are also these doctors that are more like pre-modern apothecaries or something, and they're Mary Bean, Berengaria Caswell, her real name, gets caught up in this world, and unfortunately, her life ends. So I was wondering if you could tell me if you've rethought that the immediacy or relevance of that story in the last few years with the Supreme Court ruling and the changing landscape for women.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the unexpected benefits, I suppose, of the research that I did for that, and that the book is still being taught almost 20 years later. And I'm absolutely delighted, because that's the point of publishing these stories, is to get them out into the world. And again, to have people ask questions, think about how it relates to their current situation and how we are today. So here's a wonderful example of what's going on in the United States in the 21st century. A young woman, unmarried, finds herself pregnant. What are her options? And surprisingly and sadly, Beringeber Caswell had more options in Maine in 1849 than some young women do in the United States today. And so the relevance there is just stunning. We also see, and this is kind of this was a tiny story, a sub-story when I wrote the book in 2007, but it comes to the fore now. During Dr. James Smith's trial, he was tried for the murder of Beringeber Caswell, who was known by the name of Mary Bean. A woman testified. She was a laundress from Saco, and she took care of the Smiths' linens. And during the trial, she described how the day after Beringeber died, she took the linens, the sheets, from the bed and washed them, and testified that because of the stains and the smell of the sheets, she could authenticate that Beringeber had indeed been pregnant. And she was poo-pooed in court. Oh, no, you can't tell that. The next day, a male doctor from Boston comes and testifies and says, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, you can tell, if you are of that knowledge, the smells and stains would indicate a woman had been pregnant and then not. And so we have that tension between male knowledge and female knowledge coming to the fore. At the very end of the trial, the judge says laudatory comments about the Boston doctor, and not a word about the women who testified. And so, here again, the lesson for us today is, who is making these proclamations? What is their source of experience and knowledge in order to make laws that affect 50% of the population of the United States? And so there's all sorts of lessons. And that Beringeber Caswell's very sad story and very short life can continue to impact and inform women and men today, readers today, I think is the greatest testimony to her short and sad experience.
Absolutely. And it really illustrates how relevant the study of history is. It informs us about our present world and helps us have that understanding of the continuity of some of the forces that continue to make life challenging, steal agency from certain groups, in this case, women. Absolutely. Beth, you talked a little bit earlier about your work with students and trying to light that spark in students. I was wondering how your research, how the different projects you've done through the years as a historian, how that dovetails with your teaching. Do you involve your students in some of the research ever? Do you share with them works in progress along the way? Have you designed classes or coursework within classes to draw from some of the work you're doing as a historian? What's the give and take like between teaching history and creating new knowledge as a historian?
Yeah, it's two pieces of the same pie. And I love to involve students and have very hands-on classes, because the last thing I want to do, and this was a lesson from my very first year of teaching at UNE 29 years ago, got the job, had to teach 4 brand new courses. I was going insane. And one day I realized in my world history class that I was writing lists of dates on the board. And I realized, oh my goodness, I'm replicating what I hated about history in high school. And that was the last time I did that. So what I do today, I have a couple of different methods. One method was developed quite honestly as a time saver, trying to teach new courses and get my research going at the same time. I found an opportunity to combine the teaching and the research by developing new courses. And so one example would be my current project, which featured several young women who worked and lived in the cities, New York, Boston, Washington, in the 1880s and 1890s. And this was a new time period for me. So to learn about their lives and their challenges, I developed a course on gender roles in urban America. That way I could read about their lives and teach it. Now, I was smart. I didn't call it Gender Roles in Urban America because yawn. So I called it Sex in the City, and it enrolls very quickly every semester. So another way that I've done this, had opportunities for students, was back to the Mary Bean Project. And so as I was researching the project, I was at the Saco Museum talking with the then curator, and I had an idea. Why don't we do a little display, one display case of some of the artifacts related to this case? We thought, oh, that's a great idea. And then we thought, well, what if we get a student to help? That'd be a really great experience. Oh, that's a good idea. And then we thought, well, what if we got a team of students? And the next thing you know, we were mounting a major exhibit in the major gallery in the Saco Museum. And so I co-taught a course with the then director of the Saco Museum. She adding the museum pieces, I adding the history. And we challenged that team to develop an exhibit from concept to design, the research, the graphics, the flow, the ADA requirements, everything. From day one, what should we do, to week 15, opening that exhibit. And we did it 15 weeks. And that was the first of 5 student-led museum team exhibits that I have had the incredible honor and great joy to supervise. And so we did 3 with the Saco Museum, and then we have done the most recent 2 using UNE's collection of war letters to do 2 different exhibits on aspects of correspondence in World War II. And these have been the highlight, will go down in my memory as the highlight of my teaching career.
I know how important hands-on learning is these days, and those are just wonderful examples of projects that put students right to work, taking the learning out of the classroom and extending it right into the community. Really wonderful examples.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So in 29 years, you've had a lot of students come through your turnstile through your classrooms. Have there been some success stories? Have there been? I'm sure there have been a lot, but have you kept in touch with some students who have gone on to do great things in your field? I don't know if any are at the tips of your tongue, but what kind of what can you tell me about students maybe that you know are doing great things?
Yeah, they're all doing great things. They're all doing great things. But yeah, I've been blessed to be able to keep in touch with students. Some of them are in history and history adjacent fields. Some of them are just doing amazing things in their lives beyond history. A number of students have become lawyers and attorneys and work for great causes like the environment and civil rights and social issues. And I'm so proud. One of our alums even faced down an anti-abortion picket line by turning around and saying, well, as a matter of fact, I took a course and built a museum exhibit on this very topic. And that I'm so is Steve, and I was so proud when he told me that moment. So I keep in touch with students from my very first class. The 4 students who really helped me know that I was in the right place, that my career was a history professor and it was going to be great. And it has been. And with some of our most recent grads, one of our most recent UNE grads, Maddie Mark, just completed a double master's degree at Simmons University in a master's in history and in library science with a specialization in archives. And how can you not be proud when your passion contaminates a student and they go and follow in your footsteps. So and so many and I hesitate to mention names because I know I'm going to leave somebody out, but they're all near and dear to me. And if they find any passion in my classroom, it doesn't have to be history, that something I say, something we read, some class discussion sparks that flame in their head, then I'm so happy. I've earned my salary that semester by doing that.
Absolutely. It's so gratifying to see our students become full-fledged adults and be out in the world, making their way. I know I always get a little teary-eyed when I get those occasional emails or bump into a student.
Yeah.
So I absolutely appreciate all you're saying. Let me ask you a little bit about the process as a working historian, and I imagine with the continued evolution of technology over time, maybe some of your methods have changed a little bit, the ways you go about constructing, and you're great. I'm sure you have a lot of great skills and a lot of great talents, but the one that really stands out to me in reading your work is always how you're able to tell such compelling stories from, you're not talking to people and telling their story. You're unearthing the details of their life from a very long time ago and then reconstructing it in a way that makes it really riveting reading. And I think that takes a real skill that I really appreciate. But behind the scenes, to get to that point of the finished product, there's all these possible sort of avenues you can go down, right? There's back in the day, you were going through probably microfilm. Now that's a lot easier. You were probably also going to actual locations, even though the time has passed. You can still. What are some of the? Walk us through like the process of doing some of the research you do, and how has that changed with time necessarily?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's really, technology is kind of a double-edged sword for historians. So here's a positive way that things have changed. When I wrote my dissertation on the anti-Shaker activist Mary Marshall Dyer, to reconstruct her genealogy, her family, the people she knew, her neighbors, which is a very important first step in understanding the world of women, because you have to often look beyond them to get insight into their lives. So you start with genealogy. That was back in the 1990s. I was working on that, and I put together her genealogy by going to libraries and archives in New Hampshire and Boston and literally going through paper town records to put together her genealogy. And it turned out, it's very instructive because it leads you to pathways, but it took forever while you're taking classes and, working and all sorts of things. For the Mary Bean project, I put Beringa Caswell's name into one of the online genealogy search engines, and in 3 seconds had family trees and genealogy, and there we go, which was also instructive for all types of reasons. But that's a huge time saving. Tech also helps. Computers also help in the sense of, when I worked on my anti-Shaker project, I'd go to an archive knowing they had such and such a collection, but not really knowing what was in it. And sometimes it was a boon, and sometimes it was an absolute bust. And now you've traveled all the way to Washington, and it's like, bummer. That was a lot of money. Today, we can access online finding aids. And so we know, that's the research place I want to go to. That's got the most material. Now, it's not down to like the individual letter, but you get the better, clearer sense of what an archive actually has. And some material is indeed digitized. Newspapers, which I read on microfilm. I've spent more time in the New Hampshire State Library in front of the microfilm readers, I tell you. But now, with a subscription to newspapers.com or free on the Library of Congress, that's a huge time and money saving. And certainly during COVID, being able to read material online, to communicate with archivists online, scanning material, wonderful. That said, any historian worth their salt goes and sees the originals too. There is no substitution for holding a manuscript letter in your hand. You need to feel, how thick is that paper? Is it expensive paper? Is it cheap paper? And what's on the back? Because that doesn't often get digitized. I have seen letters where key information has been cut off by the machine that digitized it. Or again, the little tiny notation that's on the back of the lower corner or on the envelope. When was it sent? From where? What was the postage? And so you still, and who wouldn't want to hold a letter in their hand that was written 200 years ago? It's so cool seeing the ink. There's something very special about that. And just lost my train of thought because now I'm thinking about archives and I want to go sit in a nice cool room and hold 200-year-old letters. Oh, going there, the sense of place. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You trace their footsteps as best you can. And when you can't see, for example, their actual house, although I have had that pleasure in my last project, when you can't see, their specific house from 1820, what other houses from 1820 survive that you can go into and get that sense of what the architecture felt like, what a lonely grave in Kentucky looks like. There's no substitute for just being there and trying to follow their footsteps.
Well said. I would have never thought of those details related to the paper stock and the backs of the paper. And I had just assumed technology was infallible and they always cut it off at the right spot. But that's really great to hear you articulate it so well. So we're working our way around to talking about your latest book. But before we get to unveiling whatever amount of its topic you want to share, let's just talk about and I know you and I have talked about this in the past, the act of actually sending your manuscript into the publisher, right? And there are still some steps to go. I'm sure there's content edits and there's a cover to be designed and you to sign off on, and maybe you have to help build an index, and you could tell us what those other steps are at some point too. But first, just that sense of sending it off. You've had a deadline, I assume, hanging over your head, like the sword of Damocles for maybe a year, maybe 2 years. You could tell us how long you were working on it. And now it's done. You did it. You sent it off. And for me, there would always be like that euphoric high when I would send a book off. And then the next day I would wake up and two things would happen. I'd say, well, what do I do now? And then I would say, oh, I should have put that in there. Oh, I just saw that, and that would have worked well. So I was wondering how that's gone for you. Has it been any of that, or is it just good to be done with it, or is it still very much alive in your daily thought process?
Yeah, it's absolutely that. There's that euphoria. In fact, with this latest project, I've worked on it for so very long, much longer than anticipated. COVID got in the way, archives closing, unforeseen circumstances. So when I actually uploaded it, went to a Dropbox and hit, send or save or whatever the button was, I actually sat back and I burst into tears. I was so happy and relieved, and just it's finally on its way. And then absolutely that. The next morning I woke up and thought, oh no, I didn't put in. Oh no, I must have. And so all the drafts and the versions and the ideas all kind of mixed in my head, and I could no longer really remember what it was I actually sent in. But after a couple of weeks, I came to peace with it. It's in, it's done. I'm waiting copy edits right now to show me where I've misplaced the commas, because I always misplace the commas. And yeah, the copy edits will be done. I'm working on the blurb that goes on the book cover. I'll have to index the book, and then we'll do a final proofread. And then it is absolutely out of my hands, and there's nothing I can do about it but look excitedly to the late spring, early summer when the book is coming out, and just get out there and tell the story.
Very exciting. I know how exciting it is to get out and actually share it with people. other than your publisher. So that'll be great. We'd obviously love to have you come back to the Center for Global Humanities and present a lecture. We'll talk about that offline. But so we're friends on Facebook, and I've been happy to watch those final stages of the book play out as you were letting people know you were working on it. But at the same time, you were a little bit guarded as far as telling us what the full story you were telling was in this latest project. And I was wondering why. First, I was wondering why that is, and I think I have some inclination as the answer, but I'd be interested to hear you express it. And then I also have done just a little detective work of my own. I noticed that in September 2021, you received an academic research grant from Sisters in Crime to investigate 19th century women detectives. So I was wondering if I'm on the right track in guessing that your protagonist or protagonists are in the detective field, perhaps an Enola Holmes type. So I don't know how much you want to tell us about your latest book, whatever you're comfortable with, but where does that you want to be strategic, I suppose, in terms of when you sort of roll out the promotional effort for your book, when you're ready to share it, when you're ready to see who else can have a reaction to it. You want to be a little strategic about that, but at the same time, at some point you have to put it out there.
That is true. And from some unfortunate lessons in the past, I've learned to be a little guarded about names and dates and archives until the book or the article is well underway. And that's an unfortunate reality of social media and the access to information that sometimes individuals borrow other people's works. So we'll leave that there. But also just trying to, make you all detectives to figure out what I'm doing. But I will tell you a little bit about the project because I'm so excited about it. So the title of the book is Alias Agnes, the Notorious Tale of a Gilded Age Spy. And here is exactly why researchers need to go to archives. I was working on a different book. And in the course of the research for that book, I stumbled onto hints of some sort of scheme behind the scheme. And as it turns out, I discovered a previously unknown female undercover detective who in the time, the Gilded Age, was called a girl spy. And she was indeed, she was an ordinary working woman who was invited to take on a position as an undercover detective working behind the scenes during a national scandal. And what really intrigued me, in addition to finding a spy, she was so good at her job that no one in her time period or beyond knew of her detective work, including the archivists who hold her family papers. So this was just, fabulously exciting. And she's a fabulously wonderful, ordinary woman who does something absolutely extraordinary. But as I looked into and researched her story, I realized that it wasn't just her tale, but she's joined by a cast of absolutely fascinating women of varying races, of varying social classes, of varying life paths. And all of these women are united by their quest for the American dream, but not the one that was usually assigned to women in the Victorian period: motherhood and marriage. Well, actually, in the reverse order, marriage and then motherhood. Most of these women wanted something different, something more. Or for those who were opting for marrying, they wanted it under their own agency, their own control, not just because society says. And I found all these women, and they're all interconnected in this scandalous story and united by this previously unknown girl spy or undercover detective. So stay tuned for more on Alias Agnes and a Notorious Tale.
It sounds great. Is it too early to pre-order a copy somewhere?
Oh, you can pre-order with a local Alfred, Maine bookstore, DeWolfe and Wood.
Ooh, I think I will. Well, that really sounds riveting. I can't wait to get my hands on it. And as I said, it'd be great to have you come in and talk at the center about your book, Alias Agnes. That sounds totally wonderful. You described yourself earlier, Beth, as why weren't historians writing about ordinary women? I would say you've turned yourself into an extraordinary woman in the course of a really illustrious career that's produced a lot of new knowledge that otherwise would have been lost to the shadows of history in our past somewhere. So I really admire the work that you've done, and I really appreciate you taking some time to sit down today remotely to talk about your work. Final question. I feel like you've answered this kind of already in a roundabout way, but a question I often ask people, our visitors that come into the Center for Global Humanities. If you had just a short elevator pitch, why do the humanities still matter? In a world where everyone's looking forward, why does history still matter? Why does your field in the humanities continue to have such relevance and such importance in our modern time? So if you had to condense that all down into a relatively short soundbite for a student or for someone skeptical of the value of the humanities, how would you articulate that enduring importance?
I would say, given that we are in the pine tree state, that trees don't stand on their own. They have to have solid roots. We have to understand the roots to see the forest in the present.
That's a beautiful expression and a beautiful note to end on. Beth DeWolfe, thank you so much for joining us today on Oh the Humanities.
Thank you. This was really my pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Oh the Humanities. As always, thanks for listening, and feel free to tell us what you thought of this conversation on the CGH social media channels: Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X.